Happy Friday, friends. We are going to close up this week's videos with the continuation through the family of promise, through Abraham's lineage. And as we're continuing to see just the promise that God is keeping of his covenant, that he is always making a way, that we are not capable of restoring the relationship that's been broken all the way back from the garden, but that God is always calling to us. He is always coming for us with his grace. And Jesus was always a part of this plan from before the foundation of the world. And we're going to continue on through our trek through Genesis. And today we're going to be talking about Joseph. But I want to rewind a little bit to where we were yesterday. And yesterday we talked about Jacob. You know, we have Abraham, who we talked about, who had the promised son of Isaac. And then Isaac had a set of twin boys, Esau and Jacob. And we saw that Jacob, though he was a trickster and a manipulator, God was not at all manipulated or tricked by that. He had a plan and a purpose, and the promise was continuing through Jacob. It reminded us that we could never be good enough, that no matter what our history is, no matter what our present situation is, no matter what evil we've done and the ways that we acted, that God restores the relationship from him to us, that we could never rack up enough rungs of good things on this ladder to God, but that God had to extend his grace to us through Jesus to make a way for that relationship to be restored. And we saw that that came through a vision that God had given Jacob. He established his covenant through Jacob. That was important because Jacob wasn't the oldest son. And traditionally, this promise, this lineage would have come through the oldest son. But God established through his word, he meets with Jacob there to say, I am the same God of your father, of your grandfathers, and I am going to continue this blessing through you. You are going to be the one to carry on this lineage of faith. My promise is still active. My covenant is still kept. And so we see a little bit of Jacob's life over the next couple of chapters, but then we're going to pick up in Genesis 35, verse 9. It says, God appeared to Jacob again. And when he came to him, he blessed him. And God said to him, your name is Jacob. No longer shall you be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. So he was called Israel. And God says to him, I am God Almighty. I am faithful and true. You be faithful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you. Kings shall come from your own body. The land I gave to Abraham and Isaac, I will give to you, and I will give the land to your offspring after you. And so we see that this promise is continued, but we see that he changes Jacob's name to Israel. And now, from now on, as we study today the life of Joseph, we're going to see that his name is now Israel, and he has these 12 sons. We hear of the 12 tribes of Israel. That is the 12 sons of Israel, the man Israel. And as we see going forward, that this became from a family that God had set apart for himself, showing his redemptive plan, his story of faithfulness, that God keeps promises. And so through this family, God changes Jacob's name to Israel. And so from now on throughout Genesis, you will see that his name is that, and he's called that, and he has these sons. And of those sons, one of them is Joseph. At the time, he was the youngest son. And not only was he Israel's youngest son, he was the favored son, because Jacob had married a wife that he loved, and he had kind of inherited another wife, but he had a wife that he loved, and she was barren, and she bore miraculously, as is the way we saw in Abraham and on throughout their family, this miraculous bringing about of a generation, of a lineage of faith. And so she has this youngest son at the time named Joseph. And he loved his son so much that he made this coat of many colors. He gave this very elaborate, lavish gift onto this one son of the wife he loved so much, his beloved wife that he loved. And she had this beloved son. She will go on to have another son named Benjamin. But at this time, he's this youngest son, and he kind of sort of flaunts that a little bit. Joseph isn't perfect, and God begins to give Joseph these visions, this vision that people and nations are going to bow down to him, that God is going to provide a way and a promise through him. He's the youngest. Again, culturally, that was not done, and that doesn't set well with your brothers. When you have 11 other brothers, you are not super popular if you say, I'm going to be the one that you're all going to bow down to. Even his mom and dad didn't really like the way he was expressing that even his mother and his father were going to bow down to him. And so he'd had this vision that God was going to set him apart. And he shared that, and that didn't go over well. And so his brothers plotted to kill him. But his older brother said, let's don't kill him. Let's just sell him. And he planned to go back and get him. They put him in the bottom of this well. And here comes some Egyptian traders, and they are slave traders, and they come through and they sell their brother Joseph, this youngest son, this beloved son of Israel. They sell him, and they tell his dad that he's dead. They dip the coat in goat's blood, and they tell him that he has died. And yet Joseph is very much alive, but he is sold into Egypt slavery. And he kind of, through his belief in this vision that God has given, that God gave a promise, and he believed God, even though it wasn't popular, even though he didn't know how it was going to work, and even though his parents and even his brothers didn't really believe it, much like Noah, much like Abraham, and moving on, these unbelievable things are coming and becoming believable and true through faith in God. And so that happens to Joseph, and he's sold. And I can't go through the whole story because we don't have time. Please read it if you get the chance to read through Genesis. But he is sold into Potiphar's home, and he raises up into favor there as God continues to have his hand on Joseph's life. And yet Potiphar's wife, she desires him. And she goes after him and tells everybody, because Joseph says, no, this is not honorable. This is not what God would want me to do. He stands against temptation. He flees the temptation. And yet Potiphar's wife, who is scorned, she tells lies about him and decimates his character, and he's put into jail, Joseph is. And yet there he believes God. He holds on to faith. He still continues to believe the promise of God, the vision that God has given him, that God will be faithful. And so he continues to walk a faithful life. And then he's raised up into the jail keeper's favor, and he is second in command. And he begins to interpret dreams. He's had his own dreams, his own visions from God, and God gives him the gift to be able to discern that. And so he begins to tell some dream interpretations to people in the jail, and they get out of jail, and then eventually they remember him when Pharaoh, the top of the top, the ruler of all of Egypt, he has these very troubling dreams, and they remember Joseph can interpret dreams, and they come true. And so they bring him out of jail, and they take him to Pharaoh, and he begins to tell the dreams. God gives him the favor, and he knows that God's the one who's going to interpret the dreams. And so he does. And Pharaoh he brings him up to second in command over all of Egypt. This little youngest son, this slave, this jailbird, the one who's been in jail and yet set free, is now second in command, except for Pharaoh, over all of Egypt. And he enacts a plan to take care of the people of Egypt, because God had said a famine was coming. He told that to Joseph through his dream interpretations. And he said, we're going to begin to provide for the people. We're going to store up the grain. And when this famine comes, then we will be able to have the provision that we need. God did that. God gave that to Joseph, and Joseph knew that. And his brothers come back, and they are reconciled because Joseph chooses to see that God had a plan. And though, as we're going to see in the scriptures today, in Genesis chapter 50, where we see Joseph, second in command to the Pharaoh, giving out provisions during this worldwide, this region-wide famine. He's the gatekeeper for these provisions, and the brothers come, and through a series of tests that he does for his brothers, he sees that they've changed, and he forgives them, and they're reconciled together. And Joseph even brings the family back into Egypt and gives them the best land of Goshen, this land of provision and promise, and they are redeemed. And we see in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, it says, Joseph says to his brothers, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God for you? You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about many people that should be kept alive as they are today." Joseph had faith in the provision and the protection and the plans of God. None of his past looked like that. There was no tangible physical reason for him to believe that except by faith. On and on, he continued to believe that God had given him visions. God had given him a purpose. God had a plan for his life. And he continued to hold on to that through everything that he went through. And when it came time to forgive those who had sold him out, the family who had rejected him, who had betrayed him, he forgave them. And he said, God had a plan. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. You see, Jesus is the provision and the way for us to receive the forgiveness of God. And we see Jesus on the cross, looking out into the very people who put him on the cross, who cried out for his murder, who sold him out and betrayed him, just like Joseph's brothers, just like those Potiphar and his wife, just like those in the jail. Everyone had turned against him that he cared about. He was betrayed. He was sold. And all of this happened to Jesus by those he loved, by Judas selling him out for pieces of silver, for Peter denying him and turning away from him, for many running and walking away from him. And yet Jesus on the cross, looking out at that, says, "Forgive them, for they know not what they've done." God, please forgive them. Have mercy on them. And that is the forgiving, merciful God that we have. And we see that walked out in Joseph's life, that God had a plan and a purpose, and that Joseph knew and believed that God would use this for good. That whatever we have in our lives that seem to be for evil, God will use it for good. Whether you are betrayed and you are denied and you are hurt by those around you, whether your circumstances are discouraging you, look around and you're like, I don't think that this is working out. I don't think that God is going to follow through on his word to me. This is not what I planned. This is not what I wanted. And yet we can look at the life of Joseph and all the suffering that he went through and also see Jesus, and that he went through the same things, and that he was a suffering Savior, and that he was denied, he was betrayed, he was mocked, he was turned against, he was sold out, and yet he forgave with unconditional love and forgiveness, and he laid down his life for us. We see the foreshadowing of that in Joseph's life. And we see the fulfillment of that lived out in the person of Jesus Christ, who forgave for good, for always, for everyone, for all of eternity. And so today, no matter what your circumstances or your relationships tell you, I know it's discouraging, I know it's hard, but I pray today you'll take encouragement from the life of Joseph, but also the life of Jesus. And look through at the ways that God was always working. He is always keeping his promises, and he is always faithful to love us, to forgive us, and to redeem us in our circumstances for good. I'll see you on Monday.